Happy New Year. It is December the 31st. It is 9:49 a.m. and we are hours away from a brand new year. So excited about what we're going to be doing this coming year in our Jubilee year, as well as continuing to work toward our goals in our Sunday school. So blessed I was just reflecting this morning in my devotions about everything that the Lord allowed me to do and experience and be a part of in 2018. And it was really a wonderful, wonderful year of opportunity. And if you look back at everything the Lord brought us through and all the things that we've done personally as well as a church, it was a wonderful, wonderful year, and excited about the plans for this coming year. Not just because it's our 50th anniversary. I think that's going to be an incredible celebration throughout the year. But we're picking up momentum in our Sunday school, and I'm excited to get past the holidays a little bit and begin to continue to build on the momentum that we were experiencing late in this year that you've been a part of. Now, you can download the lesson. Right below here, you can download it. Remember, the one that says Word at the end of it means it's a Word document. You can download that. You can edit it yourself, put your personal notes in it, highlight it, whatever, print it out. The PDF you can just look at. You can print it out, but you can just look at it. You can't make any changes to it. And then also there below, below those two, is the handout, Providential Outcomes, which is a very good activity for this lesson. Now, this is not a very difficult lesson, so it should be good as we sort of get back in the flow of things. Let me give you a couple things real quick, and then I'll go over the lesson. One, Wednesday night we'll have our normal schedule. We'll have our meetings together at 6:15. We'll be back in the dining hall. And I look forward to our time together after missing last week. And then I also wanted to encourage you. It's not an official high attendance day this coming Sunday, but it's an important day as Pastor Monroe goes over all of our plans for the new year and our Jubilee year specifically. And I want to encourage you to do everything you can, maybe to make a lot of phone calls this week and really encourage your people to be here. Even if all you did was call the core and the ministry group, those people that come, 1 to 4 times a month, not necessarily the chronic absentees. But here's something else to remember about the chronic absentees. With it being the first Sunday of January, there will be those people who will look at this as an opportunity to start over, and your phone call might encourage them to come on January, the first Sunday of January, January the 6th, and turn over a new leaf, so to speak. So I would encourage you to make as many maybe phone calls where they hear your voice as you can possibly make to encourage people to be present on Sunday morning. Now, let's take a look at your lesson. The big idea of this lesson, the big idea, and remember, in fact, we haven't talked about this in a while. If you look at your lesson, the top of it says, God is always working. For me, as I put these lessons together, that is always a twofold phrase, purpose there. There's two purposes for that phrase. One is, I guess you could look at it as a title for the lesson. I don't always title the lessons. That's not what I'm always thinking, because what I'm thinking is I always put across the top the one big idea. Now, you look at this lesson, it's actually got 2 points, but really, this lesson has 1 point. It has 1 point, and that point is God is always working. Everything in the lesson should support that. I like to use the aim of the lesson as the title, if we can keep it concise and sort of catchy, and that way you can have it on the board when they come in. I'm going to say this phrase, God is always working, 3 or 4 times in the presentation of the lesson. That's the one thing I want them to remember as they walk out the door and they go throughout the week. Remember, they are not going to remember the majority of the points that we try to make in a lesson. One of my favorite, I think it was a podcast I listened to from a conference or something. The speaker, the title of his lecture was "Less is More." When you're teaching, less is more. So we could sometimes we try to squeeze so much information, but that can have a counter effect that's not good, because it can overwhelm them and they won't remember as much. If I can simplify, less is more. And so I'll sometimes tell you'll hear me when I preach at times, or if you're ever in my class when I teach, A lot of times I will say somewhere in the introduction, if there's only one thing I want you to remember today, it's this: God is always working. And I'll say that over and over again. Making that point, I might even say, if there's one thing I want you to remember, is God is always working. Say that with me. God is always working. And I say that to keep that, I want that drumbeat of God is always working in their mind. That also helps as you prepare the lesson, because a lot of times these lessons are so long. One of the things that you have to do is you have to edit, and you have to take things out that you're not going to have time for. Anything in the lesson that does not support this idea of God is always working ought to be the first thing to go. Now, I know that when you're teaching a good lesson, I did this yesterday, you're teaching and you're having a good discussion and you can chase a little rabbit trail, and there's nothing wrong with that. But now you can't let the rabbit trail become the trail, all right? The rabbit trail, we talked for a minute and I laughed and said, okay, let's get back to the lesson. That was free, all right? I always talk about my free material. So the big idea of this lesson is that God is always working. It's the idea that no matter the circumstances in our life, God is at work. Now, what I point out in the introduction is that's very easy to see when things are going well. For the Christian, when we're blessed, when somebody gives us something, or when something goes our way, our prayer is answered, we easily see a lot of times and give God the credit for the blessing. But when the negative circumstances come, when the trials and the difficulties of life come, and the sicknesses and the deaths and the diseases, sometimes it's difficult to see the Lord working and to understand that He's working. And that should have tremendous impact on the way that we live. And we're going to look at that later in the lesson. So in the introduction here, I started off, I thought would be a good icebreaker. What did God teach you, or how did God work in your life in 2018? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen, all right? I'm just going to listen. I want them to, hey, what did God, hopefully you'll have 2 or 3 people that will share something that God did in their life, or something that God taught them in their lives in the past year. Now, I gave you a note. As you listen to people talking, one thing I really want you to listen for is if anybody shares how the Lord taught them something through a difficult time. I've shared my story with you a lot. I lived 40 years with really no problems. I mean, my life was pretty charmed. I didn't have anything. And then when 40 was when my parents moved here and everything started to spin out of control. And it was really hard in the midst of some of those difficult days with my parents' situations to realize how God was doing things. But when I got through it and I look back, those were some of the most rich times of my life where God really taught me things that absolutely changed every aspect of my life, and it was through the trials. Now, that's what you want to be listening for, okay? Don't prompt them. Just ask them, how did God work in your life in 2018, and listen. Now, if someone does say something where God taught them something through a trial, I think it would be worth, as you move on to the next question, isn't it interesting what she said? Isn't it interesting what he said? That was something that most of us would look at as something we would not want to happen, yet God used it. And you're just making the observation. Don't go into the lesson, just make the observation. And then I give you a follow-up question. Have you thought about what God may have in store for you in this new year? What God may teach you? Now, that's not a discussion question. You're not asking, what do you think God's going to do? You're trying to cast their vision forward, thinking a little bit. And then you make the point, there's one truth that no matter what happens this coming year, good or bad, there's one truth that we can take comfort in, and that ought to impact the way we think and live, and that is the fact that God is always at work. And this is where I would say, if there's one thing I want you to remember today, nothing else, it's God is always at work. Say it with me. God is always at work, all right? And I'm going to point out that's easy to see in the blessings, but difficult in the trials. And we're going to look at 2 situations in the book of Acts that both accomplished something wonderful, the spreading of the gospel, but they were both through different circumstances. All right, so number 1 is God is working in the trials. And this is the first 8 verses of Acts 8 where we see Saul, who was standing by at the stoning of Stephen. A lot of S's there. But then what you begin to see is that because of that persecution, Philip leaves and goes to Samaria, shares the gospel. And if you remember the historical context, the racial context, that the Samaritans were the enemies. They hated the Jews, and the Jews hated them. And yet here is this Jewish man, Philip, going and sharing the gospel with the enemies. And it says there that the people listened, they saw miracles, and that the city was filled with great joy. That the gospel came to a place that most people would have never taken it unless that persecution had begun to happen. Now, here's the point. Nobody wants persecution, right? Nobody wants suffering and difficulties and trials. But yet God used that to get the gospel to a group of forgotten people, people that the Jews had turned their back on. And as a result, God did tremendous works there. Revival broke out there, and the city was filled with joy. So your point for number one is that God often uses negative circumstances, persecution, to bring his plans to pass, right? So don't forget that. Now, the second point is God works in the blessings. And this is the story of the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip. All right, so both of these are with Philip, and it's the Ethiopian eunuch. Now, I don't need to rehearse that story with you, but here's my point on that one. The Ethiopian eunuch story is one that we all wish as believers that we could experience daily. I mean, don't you just wish that you would come across someone sitting there in Starbucks reading their Bible, and you say, hey, what you reading? I don't know. I need somebody to explain it to me. And you get to present the gospel. They get saved. They walk the aisle. They get back. That's the ideal. That is the blessing. It is so easy to see God at work in that situation. But the reality is that stands in contrast to point number one, that no matter what the situation, persecution or blessing, God is always at work. And that ought to impact the way that we live. Now, before we move on, let me give you an idea that I came across, because both of these are sort of familiar stories, I think, to a lot of people. One thing that you could possibly do for this lesson to make it a little bit more interactive would be you could divide the class into two groups. All right. Or if I'm in a table group department, I could say, hey, these two tables over here, you get point one. These two tables over here, you get point two. And then you give them 5 minutes. And you give them their text, and you say, okay, I want you to read the text. I want you to read Acts 8, 1 through 8. I want you to see how God was working. And how did God work? Did he work through negative circumstances, or did he work through positive circumstances? So what I'm doing is I'm giving them an assignment. I'm letting them do it, and they're going to report back, and they're basically going to teach the points for me. And all I got to do is listen and make sure they hit the points that we want to emphasize. But that would keep it interactive and interesting, I think. Then you set up for this Providential Outcomes handout. I would definitely do this. This ties together one of the more familiar but yet misquoted passages, Romans 8:28. It goes back to Genesis 50, verse 20, which we used several times in reference in our curriculum here. It connects the words of John 10:16, the words of Jesus there. I think it will begin to shape and open the eyes a little bit of our people how God is always working, and that's the point we want to make. So that would definitely be interactive. You can use that in different ways. And then you have the application at the end. And one question that I did not put on there that I wrote on my lesson this morning, that if you want to write in, and this may be the best question of all. You always think of the best stuff after you hit print, right? The question would be this. Here's how I wrote it on mine. You may want to write it down on yours. How does the fact that God is always at work impact the way that we live? Or maybe how should the fact, right? How should the fact that God is always working impact the way that we live? Oftentimes, we allow outward circumstances to dictate how we think, how we behave, how we react, if we're angry, impatient, stressed, whatever it may be. And the reality is, when we live in light of the reality that God is always at work, no matter what I'm experiencing, I'm looking for God and looking for where he is working. If you ever did the Experiencing God curriculum, that was real famous back in the early 90s. That was the whole point. The whole point was God is always working, and we look to see where he's working, and we join him in what he is doing. And, that has life-changing potential. All right. If you have someone who is completely living by their emotions, so if a situation at work goes bad, they go bad. They get angry. They get stressed. They got to storm out of the room. They got to have their quiet time, in space where they can get away from people and regroup. They're not living in light of the fact that God is at work. And when you live in the light that God is always at work, when something bad happens, yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily jump up and down for joy, but you understand, okay, wait a second, what is God trying to do in this situation? Where is he working, and how do I join him in that work? So really a great lesson, really a great lesson. Now we're going to teach this lesson, and then the next 2 weeks, January 13th and 20th, we're going to teach stewardship lessons. And January 27th is Chest of Joash. And then we'll be wrapping up this curriculum. We'll be done with this curriculum, I think, by the first or second week of May. And we're already working on our future curriculum, and I think you're going to really like it. So if you don't, just stick around. We'll change after about a quarter, okay? So I hope you have a great week. I hope you have a great New Year's Eve. I hope you have a great New Year's Day. And I will see you Wednesday, January the 2nd at 6:15. I'm working all week, so if there's anything at all I can do for you, whether it's personally or whether it's related to your Sunday school, do not hesitate to give me a call. And I look forward to serving the Lord with you in 2019, and I appreciate your faithful service. Have a great week, and I will talk to you very soon.